This is my 4-month-old old school undergravel filter tank, and so far this has been a great little project to run. I initially set this up because I was curious about undergravel filters, as there's a lot of debate online about how efficient these actually are. When it comes to water parameters, this setup has actually been surprisingly reliable, and I haven't had any issues with ammonia or nitrite levels with this tank. I also decided to give it a planted tank twist because I was interested in seeing how various species of plants would grow in both an inert gravel substrate as well as just having a steady flow circulating across their roots. So in this video I'll walk you through how I set this tank up as well as share how it's performed over the first few months. I decided to try this in a 25 litre or 6.6 US gallon nano tank because I have a few of them going spare. While this is on the smaller side in the grand scheme of things, undergravel filter systems like this one can easily be scaled up to suit larger aquariums without a huge increase in cost. I did apply some cheap window privacy film to the back panel of the tank to improve the overall aesthetic, but this is optional. This is the smallest undergravel filter plate I could find, but as you can see, it easily fits into this nano tank without issue and even leaves a little bit of space on the left hand side. The only issue that I did have is that the uplift tube is slightly too tall for the tank, so for now I decided to remove the upper part of it as well as the elbow joint. This is how an undergravel filter system works, as an external air pump drives air into an air stone in the uplift tube of the filter. As those air bubbles start to rise, they create an underpressure beneath the filter plate that then pulls water down through the gravel into the plate and then keeps the underpressure going, so the gravel acts as filter media. Speaking of gravel, I decided to give the Amtra sand and gravel mix a try, and despite its name, everything in here is pebble size, which is perfect for an undergravel filter, and there's no sand in this mix. I highly recommend washing your gravel thoroughly, as this mix does throw out a lot of dust and debris when you first get it. I rinsed it 8 times in total, and while I did think I'd gotten it clean, I probably should have washed it a few more times in hindsight. After the washing process, I simply added the gravel straight into the tank from the tub that I used to rinse it. I set this tank up in the middle of December, so the fish room was a little chilly, so as you can see there is steam coming off the gravel as it cools down. Then I spread the gravel to create an even layer over the top of the filter plate, and I add some to the open spaces on the left hand side of the tank. Now this clip is slightly misleading on the depth of the gravel because it's recorded from the front glass pane and there's not much of the filter plate here, so that does take up space deeper in the tank. I would guess once you factor in the elevation of the filter plate in the mid and background, there's probably around 1 inch of the gravel on top of it. In hindsight, I really wish I added slightly more, maybe 1.5 inches or maybe even 2 inches, because it makes planting a lot easier. But after that, I filled the tank with water, and despite washing the gravel 8 times, it still released particles into the water column. Thankfully though, the water only had some slight clouding and it did settle down quickly. Next, I hooked up the air pump to the intake on the filter, and at the time I was using these small USB powered air pumps, but I don't actually recommend these anymore. I've purchased quite a few of these over the last few years, and only one of them still works, as the diaphragm eventually seizes up at around the 1-year point break in the air pump. I also added some tap water conditioner to the tank, but to be honest, I'm still unsure whether this is actually essential or not, but it's so cheap here in the UK, I use it anyway. Finally, I needed to kickstart the nitrogen cycle, so I used some Dr. Tim's ammonia solution, which I always use for this type of cycling process, and I always get great results with it. It's very easy to correctly dose this to the aquarium, and you add 1 drop of the solution per litre of water in the tank. Then I turned off the aquarium light to reduce algae during the cycling process, since I'm using the dark start method to cycle this tank. I link to my dedicated video on the dark start method in the description if you want to know more about it, but it is my preferred method of cycling for this type of aquarium. At this stage, the ammonia level tested at 2 ppm, which is exactly where I want it to simulate a bioload of fish and get the cycle going. So moving on to the first month of the tank, and the majority of this is just cycling, and as you can see, this is a day after the initial setup and the clouding from the debris is already fading. Since I didn't have a saw at home, I took the uplift tube to my parents' house and my dad cut it down to size with some of his tools. Honestly though, I really do think a basic hand saw would have been able to get through this, as it is just pretty thin plastic. With the shortened uplift tube, I was able to reattach the rest of the undergravel filter system and get everything going. Unfortunately, within just a few weeks, the USB air pump that I was using began to seize up, so I decided to order a new piezoelectric air pump. I ended up going with the Nano model, which I link in the video description, and it's a solid choice for nano tanks, and I really do think it's a good buy. There's a bunch of different piezoelectric air pumps on the market these days, and I ended up going for the Nano one, and I link to it in the description, and so far it's been a great choice for nano tanks. You install it just like any other air pump by attaching some airline tubing between the air pump and the actual filter, and it will do the rest for you. The main advantage of a piezoelectric air pump is that there's no diaphragm and no moving parts inside the pump body, so there's nothing that can seize and break. But it is worth noting that it doesn't produce a ton of airflow, so I don't think this is suitable for air-powered filters on medium or large aquariums. Because this tank was originally unheated and the setup was done during the middle of winter, the water temperature averaged around 18 degrees Celsius or 64 degrees Fahrenheit during the cycle. This means that the cycling process is slower than usual because the water temperature is quite out of the recommended temperatures for beneficial bacteria. It took around 3 weeks before I saw the first sign of nitrite on my test kit, which confirmed that the beneficial archaea and bacteria had started to convert toxic ammonia into toxic nitrite. By week 4, algae had started to form on the tank glass, even though the light was off unless I was recording these clips, but it's mainly due to the ambient light in the room. My test kit was also shown that it had all 3 markers getting hits on ammonia, nitrite and nitrate, confirming that the cycle was in full swing. The initial ammonia dose was almost fully depleted by week 5, so I decided to add some more Dr. Tim's ammonia solution to top it up and keep the beneficial microorganisms happy and growing. Thankfully, by week 6 the tank was completely cycled and I was confident that it could easily hold the bioload of any livestock that I wanted to keep in here. Now I know this may sound like a long time, but considering this tank's running at 18 degrees Celsius or 64 degrees Fahrenheit, I'm actually quite happy with this, and some of the other tanks I set up around this time took way longer to cycle. So now that the tank is cycled, it was time to start planting, and I had 2 different aquariums to plant at this time, so these plants are split between the 2 of them. One of the first additions was the moss mat that I got from my friend who runs MMS Design Concepts on Etsy. It's a 3D printed grid that lets me add some Taiwan moss to the tank without needing any hardscape in here. This gives the shrimp a grazing area to eat microalgae and biofilm, while also letting me keep the layout simple. Then, when the moss needs trimming, I can remove the entire moss mat and trim it outside of the tank and then pop it back in there, so there's no risk of stray trimmings of moss taking over the tank and growing in uncontrolled areas. So with the moss mat prepped and ready to go, it was time to install the new light, and I chose a Ciora SR657, which is 1 step up from the normal Ciora SR616 that I use on a lot of my other nano tanks. This light kicks out a lot of power, probably in the moderate intensity range, which broadens a variety of plants that it can support, and I ran it at max intensity for 6 hours per day. I also did a partial water change to make it easier to plant everything in the tank. I always like to lay my plants on the planting tray roughly in the positions where I want them in the aquarium, as it keeps the whole process streamlined and easy. Now, I have been skeptical of the widespread belief that cryptococcine and Echinodorus species are heavy root feeders for a while now. I personally think it's just a myth that's been blown out of proportion, so in this setup I decided to test several varieties to see how they'd perform living in inert gravel. I started by placing the moss mat in the centre of the tank as the focal point, and then I planted some Echinodorus tropica nano sword plants to the left of the mat. Once they were in place, I also added some Cryptococcus nurii to the right of the mat, which were easy to plant since there's no filter plate under this section of the substrate. Then I added some Cryptococcus myoia towards the mid-left of the tank, and I think that this is the same plant that some people refer to as Cryptococcus wentii red, but I just wanted to see how it would grow. Then I added some Cryptococcus wentii green to the mid-right of the tank, and this one is a decent grower in my setups, but its max height does vary, but usually it's quite small and should be fine in this area. And finally, for the background, I added some Cryptococcus balancea, which is a variety that I haven't actually tried before, but it does have a unique look to it, so I wanted to see how it would do in this tank. I just want to point out that planting over the filter plate is more difficult than I initially anticipated, and that's why I said earlier in the video I do think adding a little bit of extra gravel would have made it a lot easier. But with everything planted, I refilled the aquarium with water, and looking back, I wish that I added a heater at this stage of the build, especially given how cold the tank was during the cycle, but like everything in the hobby, this is just a learning experience. Once filled, I added Amazon frogbait as a floating plant of choice to the tank in the hope that it would help manage water parameters. This plant's roots can get surprisingly long, and in the right conditions they may actually need to be trimmed every week, so keep this in mind if you try it in your tanks. As there's no animals in the tank to produce waste and fertilise the plants, I did decide to add a small amount of liquid fertiliser to support some early growth. I also dosed a very small amount of Dr. Tim's ammonia solution to try and keep the microorganisms fed and nourished so they wouldn't fail. A few days later, I received some messages from some of my friends in the hobby letting me know that eBay was planning to ban the sale of live animals on their platform. While eBay US did overturn this, eBay UK have actually gone through with it, which has created a few problems with the plans for my tanks, but more on that later. Thankfully, I had a thriving population of pink ram's horn snails in some of my other tanks, so I decided to move a few of them over to kickstart the ecosystem. This let me start feeding the tank by giving the snails small amounts of food and then letting their waste and any leftover food granules nourish the plants and microorganisms. To start, I was just feeding one Fluval Bug Bites dark blue label granule per snail per day, but looking back I do think this was probably too much for this setup. But the snails quickly got to work exploring the tank to try and find the food, and they also started grazing on the biofilm and algae that was forming on the tank glass, so there's plenty of things in here for them to eat. By the end of the second month, I did spot a clutch of snail eggs on the back glass of the tank, which meant that baby snails were likely to be in here over the next few weeks. So moving on to month 3, and everything seemed fine and was going according to plan, and both ammonia and nitrite levels were holding steady at 0 ppm, and nitrate levels had risen a bit, but nitrate isn't much of an issue. Because most of the plants I'd chosen for this tank were slow growers, I did start to notice a slight increase in algae growth, especially on the tank glass. Thankfully, my algae scraper made quick work of the build-up, and the undergravel filter helped pull those loose filaments down into the substrate where the snails could easily graze on them. Unfortunately, over the next week or so, the algae actually started to get worse and the tank began to turn into a small algae farm. I do think that this is due to adding slightly too much food for the snails and the lack of fast-grown stem plants in here to absorb the excess nutrients and control the nitrate level build-up. It's also worth noting that I ended up removing the Amazon frogbait around this time because it had started to melt, and I'm guessing that was due to the colder water temperature. So to combat this, I did a water change to reduce the total nutrient load that was in the water column, and I was trying to slow the algae growth. When that didn't work, and with shrimp becoming harder to find here in the United Kingdom due to eBay's ban on livestock sales, I decided to transfer a few yellow neocaridina from one of my other tanks to this setup. Now I know that some people claim Neocaridina shrimp aren't great algae eaters, but in my experience they are excellent at eating soft algae types like this. At first I only added a couple of shrimp because I was cautious, as there's always a small risk that trace elements of copper from the new plants may harm them in a new setup, so I didn't want to overload the tank too quickly. I was also doing weekly partial water changes to try and manage the nitrate buildup, as well as manually cleaning the tank glass when needed, and then I did slightly cut back on feeding to try and encourage the shrimp and snails to focus on the algae. A few days later I was doing a maintenance session on my 40-gallon tank, and I decided to add some of the excess Rotala clippings from that tank to this setup. Rotala rotundifolia has always done well for me in my tanks regardless of the setup, and it's been reliable and adaptable, and although it's not the fastest growing stem plant in the hobby, its moderate growth pace helps to keep nitrate levels in check. Adding the Rotala to the tank did remind me again of how shallow the gravel layer was over the filter plate, but you can easily overcome this in your own tanks by just adding a little bit more gravel. Around this time I also started dismantling my 29-gallon tank, so I began transferring more of the yellow Neocaridina shrimp colony from that setup to this one. I've been rearranging my fish room over the last few months, and I had to take one of my other aquariums down, and that left a group of platinum medaka and a few extra ram's horns looking for a new home, so I moved them into this setup too. Thankfully, from that point on, things really started to improve with this setup, and I was really happy with the progress. I know that it might not look like it at first glance, but just 2 days after increasing the number of shrimp and snails and adding the Rotala, the algae situation started to improve. Another 2 days after this, so 4 days in total, the tank was definitely looking better. And then by day 7, the shrimp and snails had managed to eat the majority of the visible algae, and the tank looked clean, healthy and balanced. Then, as part of my ongoing fish room rearrangement, I decided to repurpose the yellow Neocaridina tank and move the shrimp from there to this one. By the end of month 3, the tank still had some algae on the glass due to elevated nitrate levels, but the shrimp and snails were easily managing the algae growth on the plants. And that brings us on to month 4, which kicked off another round of planting, and this time I was adding more Rotala rotundifolia clippings as well as some Ludwigia mini super red from my 40-gallon tank. The Ludwigia adds a nice pop of red to the scape, and I was just curious to see how it would perform under this light. The extra Rotala rotundifolia was added to try and help manage nitrate levels, and I also had some leftover Cryptococcus novellii from a different tank that I put in here. So just to recap, at this stage the tank housed a full colony of yellow Neocaridina shrimp, 5 adult platinum medaka rice fish and a healthy number of snails, so I did decide to increase the feeding. I started by adding a full scoop of microgranules and then 1 Hikari mini algae wafer per day to make sure everything was fed. Even with this increased level of feeding, the undergravel filter continued to perform flawlessly and kept ammonia and nitrite levels at 0, and with the extra Rotala, the nitrate wasn't building up as quick as it once had. I also decided it was finally time to add a heater to the tank, as the goal was to encourage healthy, faster plant growth to also manage nitrate buildup. Looking back, I really wish I'd just added the heater to this setup from the very start, but at the time I was doing a lot of experiments with unheated cold water setups, and I just wanted to see how it would perform like this. Shortly after this, I spotted my first baby ram's horn snail, which is likely from the clutch of eggs I mentioned earlier in the video. A couple of days later, tiny baby ram's horn snails started to appear all over the tank, but whether this is a good thing depends on your priorities for your tank. If you're focusing on shrimp breeding, then the baby ram's horns can be a bit of a problem because they are heavy eaters and can outcompete shrimp for food. While I do like the added biodiversity in this aquarium, in hindsight I probably would have just went with some smaller neurite snails for this setup. That's because neurite snail eggs require brackish water to hatch, so there's no uncontrollable snail population. A few days after this, I also noticed that one of the female Medaka in the tank was carrying eggs. I've seen at least 2 batches of eggs so far, and it's only the middle of spring, so I'm excited to see how the breeding progresses over the next few months. I know that the tank still looks fairly open due to the negative space in the scape, but a lot of the plants in here are really starting to take off. With the heater now running in the tank, I also decided to move some of the Amazon frogbit from my better tank back into this one. Not only are the floating roots of Amazon frogbit ideal laying surfaces for Medaka eggs, but they'll also help manage the nitrate level build-up too. Now, I'm not sure what was grown on the roots of my Amazon frogbit, but the shrimp in this tank got on it instantly and started feeding. So that brings us up to the present day, and as you can see, the plants have really started to fill in. This tank is actually due for its first trim this coming weekend, and I'm going to have to trim the stem plants right back. A lot of the cryptocorin varieties are also transitioning to their submerged underwater form, melting back their older out-of-water leaves. You can see an example of this here where a single crypt has leaves of different colours coming out of it, and its older ones have holes in them showing that they are melting away. The Echinodorus tropica is growing slowly but steadily, and it's definitely heading in the right direction. The Ludwigia Mini Super Red has responded well to the lighting in this tank, but as usual, the low leaves are beginning to melt away. This always happens with Ludwigia in my tanks, and even the green varieties that I keep have this issue. My plan is just to remove the stems during the maintenance session and trim them down, and then replant the healthy tops back into the substrate and get rid of the bare lower portions. One potential problem that I have is that some of the Rotala stems in the setup have developed small holes, which is a bit of a mystery as this is not normal for my tanks. Holes in plant leaves often indicate a potassium deficiency, and while some of my cryptocorin plants also have holes, they are in their older leaves and it's just part of the melting process. So I am a little confused as to what's causing this, but I will monitor the situation and make any adjustments as needed with fertilization. The moss mat is also coming along nicely, and the Taiwan moss is starting to creep across the 3D printed base, and it won't be long before it forms a little mini carpet. Thankfully, water parameters have remained stable in the tank since it finished cycling, and the toxic ammonia and toxic nitrite levels have remained at 0 ppm. The extra stems of Rotala rotundifolia and the floating plants being added back to the tank also seem to have helped manage the nitrate levels, and there's no real issue with algae anymore. I do suspect that the ram's horn snails might be eating the Medaka eggs in the tank, which will be affecting the breeding success, and I really want to try and breed my platinum Medaka ricefish this year. So I am considering swapping my platinum Medaka into one of my other tanks without ram's horn snails, and then putting a different strain of Medaka or maybe some endlers into here. I've also seen a few buried female shrimp carrying eggs, so I'm expecting baby shrimp in here any week now. Now, I do wish that I'd originally gone with black gravel when I set this up, just because I'm not a fan of the white look, but I have to remind myself that the original plan was to add dark blue shrimp to this tank. Unfortunately, that did have to change due to eBay changing their policy on stock and livestock on the website, but overall I'm still quite happy with how this looks. Overall, the plants do seem to be doing really well, and they are starting to grow in and fill out the tank, so I'm happy with how things are going. So just to quickly touch on the future of this tank, and while I may add some more plants in the future and swap these fish out for a different variety, my main plan is to just leave it to grow in and observe what happens. My main goal is to just see how the plants perform over the next year or so in inert substrate with constant water flow over their roots. I'm also curious if I have any issues with gunk buildup in the gravel due to the way this filter system works, but time will tell. My current plan is if I do have problems with gunk buildup in the gravel and the filter starts clogging, I'll add some waste-eating bacteria to see if it clears things up. I recently had to do this with one of my better fish tanks where the snail waste was starting to build up on the plants and really start to make the tank look ugly. Thankfully, even though that bacteria's only been in the tank around a week, it's already making a difference as the waste-eating bacteria breaks the snail waste down and gets rid of it. So with any luck, the tank's going to keep thriving, and I'll be posting another update in December when it hits the 1 year mark. Anyway guys, that brings the video to an end and I hope it's been helpful. So far, under gravel filters really do seem like a great option in my opinion, and it's been very easy to cycle and it's been able to handle changes in bioload without issue. Thanks for watching the video guys, and good luck with any under gravel filter aquariums you're thinking of trying out.